This is Mrs. Mallard's epiphany. It's that sudden realization, that light bulb coming on. And from this point forward in the story, Mrs. Mallard is a changed person. So that makes her a round character. What was her realization? Now that my husband is dead, I am free. I get to do what I want to do with my life. I know I'm no longer bound by everything that happened before. I'm no longer bound by my husband. Now, it's at this point of the story that a lot of readers have some important questions that are bubbling around in their heads or maybe scratched out as notes in the margins of your text or in your notebook itself. So let's take a look at some of those questions and we'll see if we can't find some evidence to answer them. Okay? So, right? Chances are you might be wondering, this was Mrs. Mallard in an abusive marriage? Did Mrs. Mallard like being married? So now let's take a look at this first question here and see if we can't come up with some evidence, right? She knew that she would weep again when she saw the kind, tender hands folded in death, the face that had never looked save with love upon her, fixed and gray and dead. So what kind of a husband was Brentley Mallard? Well, it tells us that when she knows that when she goes to the funeral, she will cry again, and she describes his hands that will be folded in death as kind and tender. So if Mrs. Mallard was in an abusive relationship, would she say that her husband has kind and tender hands? No, probably not. Was Mrs. Mallard in an abusive marriage? No. Did Mrs. Mallard like being married? But she saw beyond that bitter moment a long procession of years to come that would belong to her absolutely. And she opened and spread out her arms to them in welcome. There would be no one to live for her during those coming years. She would live for herself. There would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private act upon a fellow creature. A kind intention or a cruel intention made the act seem no less a crime as she looked upon it in that brief moment of illumination. So, did Mrs. Mallard like being married? Not really. So a lot of people will say, why? And there's that, key line, there will be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have the right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. Right? Brentley Mallard, even though he was not really a bad husband, he was kind and loving, but he really wasn't a good husband, and that he imposed his will. Now, that doesn't mean he was physically abusive, right? Doesn't mean that. It means that if there was something that he wanted done in the house, it was done in the house. If he wanted them to go on vacation, then they went on vacation to where he wanted to go, right? If he didn't want to go out of town for the weekend, then they didn't go out of town for the weekend. It was his will and not hers. So this is not really abusive marriage, but it's certainly not what we would consider today a good marriage, but it fits in with the setting that we looked at earlier. So now everything kind of starts to fall into place. And then we have something significant that she keeps whispering. What does she keep whispering? Free, body and soul free. Now, we have to take a little time out here and remember what's happened. Her sister, right, after that initial outpouring of grief, led her up to her room and then closed the door. And all of this has been happening inside the closed room, right? And her sister's outside, and her sister is unaware of what's been going on inside, and she's probably worried, just like you would be if one of your siblings had lost a spouse and you were there to comfort and take care of. You'd be worried about what was going on. 16, 17, right? Her sister comes to the door and worried. She doesn't know what's going on. Sister's not worried about, doesn't know about her epiphany, what she's changed. So she asks, "What are you doing, Louise? For heaven's sake, open the door." Paragraph 18, "Go away. I am not making myself ill." No, she was drinking in a very elixir of life through that open window, right? So that image we saw earlier, the open window and the new life flows into her, figuratively speaking, triggers that epiphany. She knows that she doesn't have to bend her will to her husband's, right? And then in paragraph 20, we have an illusion. And you might not have really caught this the first time that you read paragraph 20. So go back and read paragraph 20 and see if you can pick up on the illusion. Well, did you get that one? Did you get the goddess of victory, Nike? Yeah, this is the same as the shoe. A lot of the people wonder why Nike is called Nike. Well, it's the goddess of victory. And you can do a Google image search for goddess of victory for Nike. If you just do it for Nike, you're going to see all the shoes. So you want to be sure to do the goddess of victory. That's the figure of the beautiful woman with her chest out thrown, her arms back, and her chin is up and the hair is blowing, and she's a symbol of victory. Wow. So now, why would she be a symbol of victory when, in our minds, she should still be grief-stricken? She should still be shattered from this unexpected death of her husband. Yes. Now, who's at the bottom of the stairs at the end of paragraph 20? Richard stood waiting for them at the bottom. Someone was opening the front door with a latchkey. It was Brentley Mallard, who entered, a little travel stain, composedly carrying his gripsack and umbrella. He had been far from the accident and did not even know there had been one. He stood amazed at Josephine's piercing cry, at Richard's quick motion to screen him from the view of his wife. But Richard's was too late. So what happens? Brentley Mallard, Mr. Mallard, comes home. He wasn't at the accident at all. And his wife sees him and screams. Now, why would he be trying to screen him from the view of his wife? Flip back to, remember when we first met Mrs. Mallard? She has what? She has heart trouble, right? So they were worried that the shock of seeing him alive was going to kill her. So what do we see at the end? When the doctors came, they said she had died of what? Heart disease, of joy that kills. Now here at the end, we have another literary device. So we have an allusion here. Earlier, we had imagery, epiphany, right? All of these different things combining to this really wonderful, tight story. So let's talk more about this ending next. So what do we see in this ending? The irony here. A joy that kills. Now, a lot of people wonder, well, how is that ironic, right? Stop to think. What we remembered earlier when we're down on the other side of the board, that Mrs. Mallard had heart trouble. They were trying to prevent her from the shock right, that triggered her sudden heart attack, right? So now, what could this joy that kills be? So, for Josephine, for Richards, for the doctor, right? The joy is that Brentley Mallard, the husband, is not dead. She still is married, right? So what's the irony here? Well, this is not a joy for Mrs. Mallard, right? So if we think about this, what is it that kills Mrs. Mallard? Well, it is indeed, as far as physiologically speaking, her pre-existing heart condition, but it was the sudden shock to know that her husband was alive. That wasn't a joy, that was a source of literally heartache, knowing that she was going to be thrust back into that loveless marriage. Wow. So now, as far as the theme, there's some different themes we could spin out of this really nice, tight, short story. They should all be centered upon the idea of confinement. How do we see confinement in this short story? Well, Mrs. Mallard was trapped within, she was confined within her marriage. Even though it wasn't really a bad marriage, it really wasn't a good marriage, and that confinement kept her from living the full life that she saw for herself briefly for just a few minutes after she experienced the epiphany of free, 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 body and soul, free at last. Wow, a really, really well-written little short story here for us as we begin our look into fiction. So I look forward to reading and talking with everybody and the discussion forums ahead, reading everybody's thoughtful comments. So until next time, be well, do good work, and keep in touch.